difference between the 1980s, the era of the war in Afghanistan and Lebanon, and today. I think today you can see that Arabs generally are exhausted with all this conflict. Arab public opinion in general may be against the Assad regime, but is not in favor of any military involvement in Syria. Similarly, in Turkey, the Turkish public opinion is deeply against military involvement in Syria. So we don't see that kind of excitement or that kind of agitation.
Well, Fadi, but at the same time you have the Friends of Syria saying Assad must go. Okay, it's almost a cheer you're hearing right now. How do you there's a difference here between what the street believes and certain vested interests.
I think that we have to distinguish two things. One is diplomatic condemnation and actually taking active policies to depose the Assad regime. Beyond economic sanctions and diplomatic condemnation, we don't see Western powers really doing much to overthrow the Assad regime. In addition, I would also add that Israel is not preoccupied with Syria at all. It's mostly preoccupied with the Iranian nuclear program. You barely hear any comments from the Israeli government on the current events in Syria.
Okay. Well, maybe they're just preoccupied with Iran. Majid, what do you think about that? I mean, even if Assad goes, what changes in Syria? No one ever talks about that scenario. Go ahead.
I think that one of the important is the regional aspects. If we have a proxy war in Syria, this is the worst scenario. I think Iran is a masterful of making proxies in countries. It made the proxy in Lebanon when there was a civil war in Lebanon. We had Hezbollah. It created a proxy in Iraq when there was an instability, Al-Mahdi. And I think if there would be some sort of instability, decentralized government in Syria, Iran definitely will make a proxy with the Alawite inside Syria. And I think that's the worst scenario that we can see. But again, back to your question about what will happen if Assad goes. I think first we know that this regime has lost its legitimacy and its credibility. So there is no doubt that
everybody in Syria. Let's keep that in mind, gentlemen. Not everybody in Syria feels that way. Go ahead, Majid.
Well, we can argue that majority of the people, they want a more democratic system of governance. I mean, either they're afraid of saying that,
well, in a country that has a civil war, it's pretty hard to figure out what public opinion is. Mark, you said you wanted to jump in and mention something about Israel. Go right ahead.
Well, I think Majid's point that Israel's been rather quiet on this is quite revealing because, after all, Assad's regime hasn't been a big problem for the Israelis, not since 1982. Whereas we've seen with Egypt, the change in Egypt has brought big problems on their border, and it's not impossible to imagine that, from the point of view of the Israelis at any rate, a more Muslim Brotherhood-influenced regime, let alone a jihadi-type regime in Damascus, could be a much bigger problem, and could therefore be a much more destabilizing element. One question is here, we're discussing two different things, aren't we? What is in the interests of international peace, and what is in the interests of a notional majority in Syria, what they would like to have? As you say, we don't really know what Syrians want, because the violence means that basically the people doing the fighting are the people who will decide, whoever wins will decide what the future is going to be. And sadly, in this kind of civil war, it's happened endlessly throughout history, the winners decide what the people want, and the people, if they're wise, back the winner.
Fadi, who is winning in this civil war, internally and externally? Give me a scorecard.
I think that,
go ahead.
I would say it's essentially a stalemate. The Assad regime is unable to completely defeat the Sunni armed opposition. On the other hand, the Sunni armed opposition is unable to overthrow Assad. At the same time, we can see that Moscow is keeping Washington in check. We can see also regionally that Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Qatar and Turkey are keeping Iran in check, and vice versa. So it's essentially a stalemate. I think that this conflict looks likely to drag on until exhaustion comes into play.
Okay, Fadi, so you're saying the biggest losers so far are the Syrian people, because outside forces are arming rebels.
I think that the biggest losers are the Arabs in general. The Arabs have been suffering from repeated wars in the region, from the 1980s, the Lebanese Civil War, the Iraqi wars in the 1990s, and now we have this. So the Arabs are continuously being undermined by these regional conflicts, undermining their prospects for democracy, for economic prosperity. And until these regional wars stop, the Arabs will continue to suffer, not just the Syrians, but also the Lebanese, the Iraqis, now the Turks, and the Arabs more generally.
Majid, what's the next step in your mind? Where should it go? Because there should be, it can only be a negotiated peace. Negotiated peace. Go ahead, Majid, go ahead.
I think one of the most important things first, we have to really create some humanitarian corridors. We have to create some bigger refugee camps either in Lebanon or in Jordan or in Turkey, just to allow the people who are fleeing Syria and they're fleeing this violence just to be able to have a shelter. I think this is the first thing that we have to do. And then I think here Turkey can play an important role in trying to convince the oppositional groups, unify the opposition groups to have a consistency message, and then to reach an agreement to have some sort of transitional government where Assad step aside. But this is again goes back.
I'm going to jump in here, Mark. I'm going to give you the last word in the program. 20 seconds. Go ahead.
I'm afraid the international community, Turkey lost its opportunity to be an honest broker and a mediator, and now unfortunately we have dishonest brokers, arms suppliers, and, if you like, the indifferent. And the balance between those is going to decide who wins on the ground.
Very depressing note. Many thanks today to my guests in London and in Tampa, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.